Have you ever noticed how a single smile can change the entire atmosphere of a room? One moment the air feels heavy, filled with silence or even tension, and then someone smiles genuinely, effortlessly. Suddenly it feels lighter, people breathe easier, the edges of conversation soften, hearts open if only just a little. It's almost mysterious, isn't it? Something so small, so fleeting, carries the power to shift not only how we feel but how the world responds to us. A smile isn't just a curve on the lips, it's a reflection of the mind. It's a signal that says, I am here, I am alive, and in this moment I choose kindness over fear. In Buddhism, this gentle act is more than politeness or habit. It's a living expression of mindfulness and compassion. When we smile, we're not just rearranging facial muscles. We are, in a subtle yet profound way, transforming our consciousness. We are offering peace, not only to ourselves but to everyone we meet. Think about the last time a stranger smiled at you. Maybe it was at the grocery store, maybe on a crowded train, maybe when you were having a rough day. Did you feel how your heart softened, even if just for a second? That wasn't an accident. That was energy, pure human energy, moving from one heart to another. In Buddhist teachings, this is the truth of interconnection. Nothing we do is isolated. Every thought, every action, every smile ripples outward, touching lives in ways we may never fully see. A smile is like a seed, planted and it grows, sometimes in silence, sometimes right before your eyes. One smile inspires another, which inspires another, and before long, what began as a private moment becomes a wave of shared humanity. That's the gentle power of a smile. It doesn't force, it doesn't demand, it doesn't control, it simply radiates. There's a reason why so many Buddhist masters are remembered with a smile. It's not the smile of ignorance or naivety, but the smile of someone who has touched suffering, understood it deeply, and discovered that peace is still possible. Their smile tells us, even in the midst of life's storms, there is a place of calm within. And isn't that what we long for? To believe that even when the world feels heavy, there is still a light we can share. To trust that we are not powerless in the face of negativity. That even something as delicate as a smile can hold its own kind of strength. As we begin this journey together, let's explore what a smile really means, not just as an expression but as a practice, not just as a fleeting gesture but as a way of being. Because hidden within that small, gentle act is a wisdom as old as the Dharma itself, a wisdom that teaches us how our inner state and the outer world are never separate. So let us step deeper into this mystery. Let us look closer at the mirror between ourselves and the world. And let us discover why, when you smile, the world truly smiles back. Have you ever noticed how two people can walk through the exact same street on the exact same day and yet have completely different experiences? One person sees only noise, impatience, and strangers in a rush. Another notices the warmth of the sunlight on the sidewalk, the rhythm of footsteps, the smile of a child holding their mother's hand. The world they walked through is the same, but the world they experienced, entirely different. Buddhism teaches us something profound. The outer world is not separate from the inner world. What we carry inside colors everything we see. The angry heart sees enemies everywhere. The restless mind finds only chaos, but the calm heart, the mindful mind, they encounter beauty, connection, and meaning where others see nothing. This is why a smile matters. It's not just an expression, it's a state of being. When you smile from the heart, the world begins to reflect that inner peace back to you. Suddenly, the bus ride feels less suffocating, the stranger across the street seems less distant, even the challenges of the day feel lighter. There's a Zen saying, the mind is like a mirror, it reflects whatever is before it. But when the mirror is dusty, everything appears distorted. Our emotions, our worries, our fears, they are the dust. They cloud the way we perceive reality. But when we clean the mirror through mindfulness, through awareness, through something as simple as a smile, the reflection changes. The world shines clearer. Imagine for a moment, you wake up late, rush out the door, and spill coffee on your shirt. You carry frustration like a shadow. The world feels against you. Drivers seem rude, colleagues appear unfriendly, the day feels unbearable. Now imagine the same morning, but this time you pause, take a breath, and let yourself smile despite the chaos. You don't deny the spill or the lateness, but you choose not to let it poison your mind. Suddenly, the world softens. That driver might still cut you off, but it doesn't feel like an attack. Your colleague's silence feels less like rejection and more like someone just lost in their own thoughts. Nothing outside has changed, but everything inside has. The Buddha once said, "With our thoughts we make the world." That's not poetry, it's truth. The smile you wear is not simply seen by others. It reshapes your own perception, which in turn reshapes how others respond. The world becomes a mirror of the energy you bring to it. Think of it like standing before a lake. If the water is disturbed, the reflection is broken, chaotic, unreadable. But when the water is still, suddenly the reflection is clear, calm, almost beautiful. Our mind is the same. A smile is a way of stilling the waters, reminding us that clarity and peace are always within reach. And here's the wonder. When you meet the world with this clarity, the world meets you back. Strangers are more open, conversations flow more easily, opportunities seem to appear out of nowhere. Is it magic? No, it's resonance. When you smile, you are tuning your mind to harmony, and the world reflects that harmony like a faithful mirror. So perhaps the real secret isn't to chase a better world out there. Perhaps it's to shape a better world in here. Because when the mind smiles, reality itself smiles back. And this is only the beginning. If the world truly mirrors our inner state, then every smile, every thought of kindness, every spark of compassion becomes more than personal. It becomes collective. Which leads us to another hidden truth. Every smile is a seed. And what grows from that seed can transform not only your life, but the lives around you. Every action we take, every word we speak, and even every thought we nurture, these are all seeds. In Buddhism, we call this karma. Karma is not punishment, nor is it reward from some distant force. It is simply the natural law of cause and effect. Plant a seed of bitterness, and bitterness will grow. Plant a seed of kindness, and kindness will bloom. A smile may seem small, almost insignificant, but in truth, it is a karmic seed with tremendous potential. When you smile with genuine warmth, you're planting joy not only in your own heart, but also in the hearts of those around you. And like all seeds once planted, it has the power to sprout, to grow, and to multiply. Think of a time when you were weighed down, maybe exhausted or discouraged, and then someone offered you a simple, sincere smile. Did you feel how it lifted you, even if just for a moment? That uplift was a fruit, the karmic result of someone else's seed of compassion. And if you then passed on that same energy, smiling at another, the cycle continued. This is how a single smile can ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the one who first shared it. There is a story told in many Buddhist circles about a woman who lived in constant sorrow. One day, as she walked through the marketplace, a monk passed by and smiled at her. Just one smile. For reasons she could not explain, it softened her grief, if only slightly. That moment stayed with her. Later, she recalled the monk's gentle smile when she was about to lash out at her child in frustration. Instead, she paused and smiled instead. Her child, startled, smiled back. Years later, that child grew to be a kind and compassionate person, spreading joy to many others. All of this, an entire chain of transformation, began with one smile from a stranger, a seed planted quietly without demand. This is the way of karma. Just as anger can ignite anger, kindness can ignite kindness. And a smile is one of the simplest yet most powerful ways to plant the seeds of kindness in the soil of human hearts. But here's something beautiful. The seed doesn't only grow in others, it grows within you too. When you smile sincerely, your own body responds. Stress softens, tension melts, the mind clears. Neuroscience confirms what Buddhism has taught for centuries. Smiling changes your state of being. In that moment, you are literally planting joy within yourself. You are cultivating fertile ground for peace to flourish. And like any seed, the more you nurture it, the stronger it becomes. Every time you choose to smile with awareness, even in difficulty, you're watering that seed of resilience. You're strengthening your karmic habit of joy. And just as a tree bears fruit season after season, your practice of smiling sows a harvest of peace for yourself and everyone around you. So what does this mean for us? It means that we don't have to wait for the world to change before we can feel joy. We don't have to wait for a perfect life before we share compassion. Right now, in this very moment, we can plant a seed. A small, gentle, radiant seed that may grow into something far greater than we imagine. And once we understand that even the smallest actions carry karmic weight, we begin to see that a smile isn't just a fleeting gesture. It is a form of practice. It is meditation in motion. It is compassion made visible. The question is, if each smile is a seed, what kind of garden do we wish to grow? Because every garden begins the same way, with a single seed planted in hope. And that's where the mystery deepens. Sometimes the seeds we plant grow silently, beyond our knowing. Sometimes they blossom not in our own garden, but in the hearts of others. Which is why even the smallest act of kindness, even a silent smile, is never lost. It is simply waiting for its season to bloom. There are moments in life when words fail us. When pain is too deep to be fixed by advice, when sorrow is too heavy for explanations, when joy is so pure it doesn't need describing. In those moments, what speaks louder than language is presence, and often presence reveals itself in something as simple as a smile. A genuine smile is compassion in its purest, most silent form. It doesn't argue, it doesn't persuade, it doesn't demand. It simply says, "I see you. I recognize your humanity. You are not alone." Think about a child who falls and scrapes their knee. Before any words are spoken, the parent bends down, holds them, and smiles gently through the child's tears. That smile carries reassurance more powerful than 1,000 sentences. Or consider the moment when two strangers cross paths in a hospital waiting room. No conversation, no introduction, just a quiet smile that says, "I know this is hard. I'm here with you." That smile is a bridge, invisible yet undeniable. Buddhism teaches that compassion is not limited to grand gestures or elaborate rituals. Compassion is in the subtle, the ordinary, the everyday. A smile becomes a vessel for compassion when it springs from the heart. In that instant, you are not just curving your lips, you are transmitting an energy of safety, kindness, and care. There's a story of a great Zen master who was known for smiling more than he spoke. Students often came with questions, complicated, intellectual, philosophical. Instead of offering lengthy explanations, the master would simply smile. At first, the students were frustrated. They wanted doctrines, they wanted words. But over time, they began to understand. His smile was the teaching. It was the embodiment of equanimity, the silent dharma. His smile said what words could not, that peace is not found in concepts but in presence. Science, too, supports this truth. A smile bypasses the barriers of language and culture. It's universal. You don't need to understand the grammar of another's tongue to understand the warmth in their smile. It's why travelers feel welcome in foreign lands, why enemies can soften into allies, why hearts separated by oceans can still connect. A smile cuts through all of it. And here's something powerful. When you smile at someone, you give them permission to be human again. You remind them that beneath the stress, beneath the roles they play, beneath the defenses they carry, there is a simple truth: we are all alive together right now. In that recognition, compassion is born without a single word spoken. But let's not mistake this compassion for something shallow or naive. A real smile does not ignore suffering. It meets suffering with courage. It does not deny pain. It offers a hand through the pain. To smile at someone who is hurting is not to dismiss their hurt. It is to acknowledge it, to honor it, and to say silently, "You are more than your suffering. There is still light within you." And the beauty of this silent language is that it travels faster than speech. One smile can ripple through a crowd. It can soften the rigid, ease the anxious, uplift the weary. Just as a candle doesn't lose its flame by lighting another, a smile loses nothing in being shared. Instead, it multiplies, echoing through hearts like an unspoken chorus. So perhaps compassion doesn't always need sermons or sutras. Perhaps at times, the most profound dharma is a smile that carries kindness across borders, a smile that heals without medicine, a smile that transforms strangers into fellow travelers on this human journey. And when we realize that compassion can flow through such a small, silent gesture, we begin to wonder, how far can it reach? How many lives can be touched by something so seemingly ordinary? The answer lies in the nature of resonance. Just as a single tone can set an entire instrument vibrating, one smile can travel farther than we imagine, carried through the unseen networks of human connection. Which is why, sometimes, the smile you give today may return to you years later, in ways you never expected. There's a reason why we say a smile is contagious. It spreads, it moves, it multiplies, and often it travels farther than we could ever imagine. Picture this. A young woman exhausted after a long shift sits quietly on a subway train. Her face is heavy with fatigue. Across from her, a little boy catches her eye and simply smiles. Something stirs inside her. Without even thinking, she smiles back. That small exchange lifts her mood, and when she steps off the train, she greets the station attendant with a brighter expression. He, in turn, feels seen, acknowledged, and carries that lightness into his day. By afternoon, he shares a kind word with a colleague who later brings it home to her family. The ripples continue. What began as a simple smile from a child now echoes through countless lives. This is how energy moves. This is how stories travel, not always in words, but in gestures, in feelings, in the subtle transmission of joy. Buddhism teaches us the principle of interbeing. Nothing exists alone, and nothing we do remains isolated. Just as one candle can light 1,000 without losing its own flame, one smile can ignite countless others without ever running dry. It becomes a chain of compassion, an invisible current running through the human family. Modern science, too, confirms what ancient wisdom has long known. Our brains are wired with something called mirror neurons, cells that respond to the emotions we see in others. When we see a smile, these neurons fire as if we ourselves are smiling. It's why joy feels infectious, why laughter spreads so easily, why kindness rarely ends with the one who begins it. Our very biology is designed to resonate with one another, and this resonance is why a smile has the power to go viral, not only in the digital sense of videos and social media, but in the lived reality of daily human connection. Think about the countless videos you've seen online of people simply sharing joy. Strangers dancing, children laughing, people hugging, people smiling. They go viral not because of clever editing or marketing tricks, but because they awaken something universal within us. They remind us of our shared humanity. There's a famous Buddhist image of Indra's net, a vast web stretching infinitely in all directions. At every intersection there is a jewel, and in each jewel the entire net is reflected. A smile works the same way. When you smile at one person, you're not only touching them, you're touching the entire network of lives they are connected to. Your smile may echo in places you will never see, in people you will never meet. So when we say a smile is contagious, we are not speaking metaphorically. We are describing a real, living truth. Smiles travel. They leap across barriers of language, culture, and circumstance. They turn strangers into companions, adversaries into friends, silence into warmth. And here's the beauty. You never truly know where your smile will end up. Maybe it will soften the heart of someone who was about to give up. Maybe it will remind a lonely soul that they still matter. Maybe it will inspire someone to be kind when they had every reason to be cruel. These are the invisible stories, the ones that travel silently through the world, seeded by something as gentle as a smile. If compassion without words is the language of the heart, then the virality of a smile is its song. It is a melody carried from one person to another, across homes, across cities, across generations, and like a song, it lingers. It stays in the memory long after the moment has passed. But here is where the story takes an even deeper turn. If smiles can spread so easily, what about frowns, anger, resentment? Negativity too can travel. It can infect. It can multiply. Which means that each moment we face a choice. What do we wish to set in motion? What do we want to send traveling into the world through our presence? Because whether we realize it or not, we are always planting, always transmitting, always shaping the atmosphere around us. A smile is not just a personal gesture. It is a public offering, a gift to the collective spirit of humanity. And this is where the practice becomes more than personal. This is where it becomes revolutionary. For if enough of us choose to smile, not as a mask, not as pretense, but as genuine acts of kindness, we can shift the tide of energy in the spaces we live in. And when we begin to understand the viral nature of joy, it becomes clear. A smile is not only powerful, it is responsibility. Have you ever walked into a room where the air felt heavy, where no one said a word but you could sense tension lingering like smoke? Maybe someone was angry, maybe someone was hurt, and without even realizing it, everyone else in the room started carrying that same energy. Negativity spreads like that. It doesn't always need words. A frown, a sigh, an impatient tone, it's enough to pull others into the storm. This is the cycle many of us live in every day. Stress at work turns into frustration at home. A harsh word from a stranger lingers in our mind until we pass it along to someone else. Pain circles from one person to another, like a wheel spinning endlessly. In Buddhism, this is samsara, the cycle of suffering, repeating itself again and again. But what if one simple gesture could break that cycle? What if one smile could interrupt the wheel of suffering and replace it with something lighter, kinder, more human? Picture this: a man stuck in traffic, honking angrily at every car in his way. By the time he gets to the grocery store, he snaps at the cashier for moving too slowly. The cashier, already tired, takes that negativity home, where her mood spills into her family's dinner. The chain continues. But imagine instead that when the man arrives at the store, the cashier meets him with a calm, genuine smile. That smile doesn't erase his frustration completely, but it disrupts it. It softens the edge. It gives him a reason to pause, to breathe, to remember that not everything in the world is against him. The cycle breaks. A new energy begins. This is the power of mindfulness in action. A smile isn't just a social nicety, it's a conscious choice to stop negativity from spreading any further. It's a declaration that says, the anger stops with me, the stress ends here. Buddhism teaches that every moment gives us the chance to choose. We may not control what others send our way, but we can choose what we pass on. A smile offered with awareness is like placing a stone in the wheel of samsara. Suddenly, the cycle halts. Instead of transmitting pain, you transmit peace. And here's something profound. Breaking the chain doesn't only free others, it frees you. Because the moment you choose to smile instead of retaliate, you free yourself from carrying the poison of anger. You refuse to be its messenger. You step out of the current of suffering and onto the shore of compassion. It doesn't mean life will always be easy. Negativity will continue to swirl around us. People will still be impatient, still be rude, still be caught in their storms. But you hold the key to your response. And in that response lies the seed of transformation. Think of it like a relay race. Each person hands the baton of energy to the next, anger for anger, kindness for kindness. At any moment, you can decide to drop the baton of anger and pass along something new. That choice may seem small, but it changes the entire outcome of the race. This is why a smile matters so deeply. It's not just about personal happiness, it's about collective healing. When you smile, you're not ignoring negativity, you're breaking it. You're declaring that the energy ends with you and what continues from here is something better. And once you understand this, the question becomes clear. How do we cultivate a smile even when life is difficult? How do we find the strength to smile not only when things are good, but especially when things are hard? The answer lies in a deeper wisdom, the smile that endures suffering, the smile that rises not from denial but from understanding. There's a simple truth we often resist. life is not always kind. Suffering visits every one of us in forms big and small. A loved one falls ill, a dream crumbles, a friendship fades. Sometimes it's daily struggles, a bill you can't pay, a harsh word that lingers, a loneliness that seems endless. In those moments, a smile may feel impossible. How can one smile when the heart feels broken? But Buddhism teaches something radical. Suffering itself can be the ground from which wisdom and compassion grow. The Buddha's very first teaching after his enlightenment was about dukkha, the reality of suffering. He didn't hide from it. He faced it directly, and in doing so, he discovered a path beyond it. So when we speak of smiling through suffering, it isn't about pretending pain doesn't exist. It isn't about forcing joy when life feels heavy. It's about a different kind of smile, a smile born not from denial but from understanding. Imagine a monk sitting in meditation during the rainy season retreat. Thunder rolls outside, rain floods the temple grounds, mosquitoes swarm the air. The discomfort is real, yet on his face is the softest of smiles. Why? Because he knows this too shall pass. Every storm, no matter how violent, eventually dissolves into stillness. That smile is not ignorance, it is wisdom, the recognition of impermanence. Or consider the story of Thich Nh letter 1EA5T H letter 1EA1NH, the Vietnamese Zen master. During the war, he saw unimaginable suffering, villages burned, families torn apart. Yet he taught his students to breathe and to smile. Not because there was no pain, but because the smile was an act of resistance against despair. To smile, even amidst devastation, was to say, "Suffering will not consume me. I will not let hatred destroy my heart." This kind of smile is strength. It does not erase sorrow, but it transforms the way we carry it. Instead of drowning in grief, we learn to hold it gently like a mother holding a crying child. The smile becomes a reminder. Yes, there is pain, but within me there is also resilience. Within me there is still light. Modern science echoes this truth. Psychologists call it emotional reframing. When we smile in the midst of hardship, even a small smile, the brain begins to release signals of calm, lowering stress and opening space for clearer thought. What Buddhists have practiced for centuries, science is only now beginning to confirm. And perhaps most importantly, your smile in suffering gives courage to others. Think of a hospital ward. A patient undergoing chemotherapy smiles at the nurse. That smile is not free from pain, it shines through it. But for the nurse, for the family watching, it becomes a beacon of hope. It says, even here in this place of suffering, life still has dignity, still has beauty. This is the essence of the Bodhisattva spirit, the vow to remain compassionate, even in the heart of suffering. The Bodhisattva does not wait for perfect conditions to offer kindness. Even in difficulty, even in pain, they radiate compassion for the sake of others. So when suffering comes to you, and it will, remember, your smile need not be perfect. It need not hide your tears. But if it carries understanding, if it carries compassion, it becomes unshakable. It becomes a Dharma gate, leading you deeper into the truth of impermanence, interconnection, and resilience. And when that smile rises from the depths of suffering, it carries a different kind of beauty, one that is raw, real, and transformative. Because if a smile can exist even in the darkest night, then dawn is already on its way. Think for a moment about how you start your day. Is it with rushing, scrolling, worrying? Or is it with a breath, a pause, a smile? The truth is, most of us treat a smile as something accidental, something that happens when life feels good. But in Buddhism, a smile can be more than a reaction. It can be a practice, a conscious act of mindfulness woven into the fabric of daily life. Thich Nh letter 1EA5T H letter 1EA1NH once taught a very simple exercise. Breathe in and smile. Breathe out and release. At first it feels almost too simple, too childlike, but try it, really try it. With each breath you invite calm. With each smile you remind yourself that in this very moment you are alive, and that alone is a miracle. This is not about plastering a fake grin on your face. It's about cultivating a smile that arises from presence. When you wash the dishes, you can smile at the warm water touching your hands. When you drink tea, you can smile at the fragrance rising from the cup. When you walk outside, you can smile at the sky, the trees, even the strangers passing by. Suddenly, the ordinary becomes extraordinary because you are awake enough to notice. Daily practice is not built in monasteries alone. It is built in the flow of our everyday lives. Every smile you offer is like a pebble dropped into the river of your day, creating ripples that extend far beyond what you can see. And science supports this ancient wisdom. Studies show that deliberately smiling, even for just a few moments each morning, can shift your mood for hours. It sets a tone of openness and reduces stress. In a way, smiling is a form of mental hygiene, like brushing your teeth, but for your heart. Consider also how this practice shapes your relationships. Imagine beginning each interaction, no matter how small, with a genuine smile. Greeting a coworker, thanking the barista, speaking with your child. That simple choice builds trust, softens defenses, and deepens connection. Over time, your life becomes surrounded by an invisible web of warmth, all woven from something as simple as a smile. And here's the beautiful paradox. The more you practice smiling, the more reasons you find to smile. Like training a muscle, the act of smiling strengthens your ability to see goodness, even in unexpected places. In Buddhist terms, this is cultivating bhavana, mental development. Just as monks train their minds in meditation, we too can train our hearts in smiling, not as a shallow habit, but as a daily discipline that gradually transforms the way we see ourselves and the world. Of course, some days will be harder than others. Some mornings the smile won't come easily. That's okay. The practice is not about perfection, it's about intention. Even the smallest smile offered sincerely carries the power to shift the day. So the next time you wake up, before you reach for your phone, try this. Pause, breathe, and smile. Feel how your heart softens, how your mind becomes lighter. In that moment, you're not just starting a day, you're shaping the energy that will flow through every hour to come. And when a smile becomes part of your daily practice, it no longer depends on chance. It becomes a steady flame, burning quietly, guiding you through both calm waters and stormy seas. Because when you make smiling a practice, you discover something profound. Happiness isn't something you wait for, it's something you choose, one smile at a time. For centuries, Buddhist monks have taught that a smile is medicine for the heart. But today, modern science is catching up, proving that this simple gesture carries profound healing power for the mind, the body, and even society itself. Think about the last time someone smiled at you on a difficult day. Perhaps it was a stranger on the street or a loved one at home. In that moment, didn't something shift inside you? The heaviness lightened, even if only slightly. Science tells us this isn't imagination, it's biology. When you smile, your brain releases dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins, the same chemicals that fight stress and lift mood. Your heart rate slows, your blood pressure lowers, muscles throughout your body relax. A single smile becomes a full-body signal that says, "You are safe, you can breathe again." And here's the remarkable part. You don't even need to wait for happiness to smile. The very act of smiling, genuine or intentional, triggers the brain to generate these calming responses. In other words, smiling doesn't just express joy, it creates it. Buddhism has always known this truth in another language. The Buddha taught that the mind shapes reality. Our inner states ripple outward, shaping the way we see and experience the world. When you cultivate a smile, you cultivate the seeds of well-being, not only for yourself, but for everyone around you. Medical studies now show that patients who smile and laugh during treatment experience less pain, recover more quickly, and even show stronger immune responses. Imagine that, a smile, something weightless and free, strengthening the very systems that keep us alive. And it doesn't stop there. Neuroscientists have discovered something called mirror neurons. When we see someone smile, our brain lights up as if we ourselves are smiling. This is why smiles are contagious. Your smile doesn't just heal you, It awakens healing in others, passing strength from one heart to the next like a flame lighting countless candles. Let's bring this into a real-world story. A young nurse in a children's hospital once said, "I've seen medicine help, but I've also seen a smile work faster." She spoke of children in pain who, when greeted with a warm smile, would unclench their fists, slow their breathing, and allow the healing process to begin. The science of biology and the wisdom of Buddhism met in that moment, and the result was undeniable. But healing isn't only physical. A smile also heals the unseen wounds, the loneliness, the despair, the quiet battles people carry within. To smile at someone is to say, "I see you, you matter, you are not alone." In the Buddhist teachings, this is compassion, K-A-R-U letter 1E47A macron, expressed in its simplest form. And what happens when we bring science and Buddhism together? We see that a smile is not a trivial gesture, but a bridge between the spiritual and the physical. It is both medicine and meditation. It is both chemistry and compassion. So when you smile, you are engaging in a practice far more powerful than you realize. You are healing your body, calming your mind, and sending ripples of healing into the lives of others. And if one smile can heal, what might happen if entire communities practice smiling with awareness, compassion, and presence? That question leads us to a final reflection, the place where all of these teachings converge. Because beyond the science, beyond the stories, lies the ultimate truth about what a smile really means in the journey of human life. From the very beginning, we followed a simple truth. When you smile, the world smiles back. Along the way, we discovered that a smile is not just an expression, but a mirror of the mind, a seed of karma, a silent language of compassion, and a force that can ripple through communities, heal wounds, and even transform suffering itself. But what matters most is this: every smile you offer finds its way back to you. Like an echo across the mountains, like a wave returning to the shore, the kindness you share does not vanish. It circles through life and returns home. Perhaps not immediately, perhaps not in the way you expect, but sooner or later, the smile you gave on a weary morning, the smile you offered to a stranger, the smile you managed through your own tears, they return. They return in the warmth of a friend's embrace, in the resilience of your own spirit, in the unexpected kindness that meets you on your hardest days. This is the law of interconnection. In Buddhism, it is said, "This is because that is." Your smile exists not in isolation, but as part of a living web of causes and conditions. Every time you choose to smile with sincerity, you shift the fabric of that web, and in time, the world shifts back toward you. So as we close this journey, remember this: a smile is not small. It is not trivial. It is the doorway to healing, the spark of connection, the mark of resilience, the gift of compassion. It is your daily practice, your strength in adversity, your offering to the world. And when you give it freely, the world cannot help but give it back. So take a breath. Let your lips soften. Let your heart open. And smile, because somewhere someone needs it, and because deep down, so do you. And when the smile returns, as it always does, you'll know that what you offered was never lost. It simply traveled through the world, gathering light, until it found its way back to where it began. Right here, with you. If this reflection touched something in your heart, I invite you to continue this journey with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, where we share teachings, stories, and practices that nourish peace, compassion, and clarity in everyday life. And if you feel called, share this video with someone who might need a gentle reminder today. A reminder that even the smallest smile can change the world. Thank you for walking this path with us. Until we meet again, may your days be filled with mindfulness, kindness, and the quiet strength of a smile.